What if the Japanese had refused to surrender? A chilling alternate history of World War II. Introduction: The brink of collapse. By the summer of 1945, Imperial Japan stood on the precipice of total defeat. Its navy had been shattered, its air defenses dismantled, and its cities, once proud centers of culture and industry, lay in ruins from relentless Allied firebombing. The American war machine had methodically dismantled Japan's imperial defenses, severed supply lines, and crippled its economy. Yet despite these overwhelming losses, surrender was not inevitable. Within the highest circles of Japan's wartime government, fierce resistance to capitulation remained. The question was not just about defeat. It was about honor, tradition, and the fear of internal rebellion. Internal tensions, a nation on the edge. Behind closed doors, Japan's leaders grappled with a profound dilemma. Accepting the Potsdam Declaration meant more than an end to the war. It threatened the very foundations of Japan's militarist society. Any indication of surrender risked provoking extremist factions within the imperial army, many of whom believed that continuing the war, even to the last man, was preferable to dishonor. And then it happened. The seeds of rebellion took root. The Kyujo incident, a coup in the shadows. While largely unknown in the West, one of the most critical moments in Japan's modern history is widely remembered by the Japanese people. It is known as the Kyujo incident, and its retelling is immortalized in the 1967 film Japan's Longest Day, often aired on the anniversary of Japan's surrender. At the heart of this event was a small group of radical young army officers. Convinced that surrender would destroy the empire's soul, they sought to incite a military coup to overthrow the civilian government and continue the war. These officers approached several senior commanders, attempting to gather support for their desperate plan. Their hopes rested heavily on one man, General Korechika Anami, Japan's powerful and respected minister of war. The man who held the line, General Korechika Anami. General Anami was a complex figure. Fiercely loyal to the emperor and a staunch nationalist, he nonetheless carried a deep sense of responsibility for his nation's fate. Portrayed by legendary actor Toshiro Mifune in Japan's Longest Day, Anami stood at a pivotal crossroads in history. Though he sympathized with the rebellious officers' anguish and their desire to preserve Japan's honor, Anami ultimately rejected their plan. His decision not only preserved the civilian chain of command but also allowed Japan to formally surrender, just hours before the rebels could seize control. Alternate history: what if Anami had said yes? But what if he hadn't? What if General Anami had sided with the coup plotters and thrown his considerable influence behind their cause? Such a decision would have plunged Japan into immediate civil conflict. The rebels' first action would likely have been the assassination or capture of key government figures, possibly including Emperor Hirohito himself, who had already recorded his message of surrender. They may have destroyed or blocked the transmission of the imperial broadcast scheduled for August 15, 1945, plunging the country into chaos. Without a clear directive from the emperor, Japanese garrisons throughout Asia and the Pacific might have continued fighting, believing surrender was either illegitimate or dishonorable. Allied forces, already preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would have proceeded with a full-scale assault on the Japanese home islands. The death toll would have been staggering. American planners estimated casualties in the hundreds of thousands for their forces alone, with Japanese civilian and military losses reaching into the millions. Worse still, had resistance continued into late 1945 or early 1946, the United States may have resorted to further atomic bombings, not just of cities but of key military sites and infrastructure. Japan's post-war future, socially, politically, and culturally, could have looked very different. Hirohito's surrender, a sacred gamble. Even in the face of utter devastation, key figures in Japan's military hierarchy remained deeply opposed to surrendering unconditionally. Among them was General Korechika Anami, who, along with two other members of Japan's Supreme War Council, held fast to the belief that Japan should continue the fight. Their aim was not outright victory. By then, such an outcome was out of reach, but rather to inflict enough damage on the Allies to secure a more favorable, negotiated peace. This internal divide grew sharper in early August 1945, as the war's final and most traumatic events unfolded. On August 6, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, leveling the city and killing tens of thousands. On August 8, the Soviet Union, until then neutral in the Pacific, declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. And on August 9, a second atomic bomb devastated Nagasaki. Despite this unprecedented level of destruction, Anami and his allies refused to back down. They believed surrender, especially on Allied terms, would spell the death of the Kokutai, the core ideology of the Japanese state which revered the emperor as a living deity. To accept defeat without safeguarding the emperor's authority was, in their eyes, to erase the soul of the nation. But a different perspective emerged within the same chamber of power. The other half of the Supreme War Council, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yanai, recognized that continued resistance would only bring further annihilation. They urged surrender, not from cowardice, but from a profound sense of national preservation. Faced with a deadlock, the decision fell to a man whose voice transcended politics and warfare, Emperor Hirohito. This sacred decision, breaking the deadlock. On August 10, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made what would later be called his sacred decision. He broke precedent by directly intervening in political affairs, something Japanese emperors had traditionally avoided. In a private meeting with senior military and civilian leaders, Hirohito declared his support for accepting the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. This moment was unprecedented in Japanese history. It was not just a political act, it was a moral and spiritual appeal to the nation. Hirohito's decision, grounded in his role as a symbolic and unifying figure, became the turning point that ended internal debate and forced the military leadership to reconsider their stance. But even this surrender came with conditions. Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration was accompanied by a carefully worded statement that it was submitted, with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. The Allies responded on August 11 with deliberate ambiguity. Their reply stated that, "The authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers." This phrasing left open the possibility that the Emperor could remain, under Allied oversight, but it offered no explicit guarantee. To some in the military, this was intolerable. To others, it was a face-saving compromise. But it was enough to allow the Japanese leadership to proceed. A nation holds its breath. Even after Hirohito's decision, danger still loomed. Hardliners within the military viewed any form of surrender as treason. The days that followed were marked by plots, arrests, and the final stages of the failed Kyujo incident, the attempted coup by officers who believed Hirohito had betrayed Japan. General Anami, torn between duty and conscience, ultimately sided with the emperor's decision. In a final gesture of loyalty, he took his own life on the eve of the surrender broadcast. His suicide note expressed regret for the loss of the war but remained silent on the politics of surrender, a choice that continues to fascinate historians to this day. The narrow path not taken. Had Hirohito hesitated, had Anami resisted, had the Kyujo coup succeeded, the path of history could have veered into unthinkable territory. Japan might have fractured into warring factions. The Allies might have responded with additional atomic bombings, or a full-scale land invasion. The cost in human lives on both sides would have been catastrophic. Instead, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, a date etched in the memory of a nation and the world. The Kokutai, in a reinterpreted and symbolic form, survived. Hirohito retained his throne, though stripped of divinity. And Japan, devastated but intact, began the long road to reconstruction. The coup against defeatists, a nation on the brink. As Japan's wartime leadership quietly explored surrender terms, secrecy was paramount. Any hint of capitulation risked igniting unrest within the military ranks. But the illusion of unity was short-lived. Within the Army Ministry's Military Bureau, 6 mid-level officers uncovered the negotiations and deemed them not only misguided, but treasonous. To these officers, the push for surrender was not a loyal act of preservation but a betrayal of the Kokutai, the spiritual and political foundation of the Japanese state centered on the divine role of the emperor. They believed Emperor Hirohito had been manipulated by defeatists in the government and that their true duty was to protect the emperor from those who would undermine him. Their solution? A military coup. The conspiracy deepens. A plan to seize power. The officers' plan was bold, even audacious. They sought to overthrow the civilian government, cut off communication with surrender advocates, and place absolute power into the hands of the military, specifically General Korechika Anami, whom they saw as a potential savior of Japan's honor. Success hinged on two powerful military units. The Imperial Guards Division, tasked with protecting the emperor and the palace, under the command of General Takeshi Mori. The Eastern District Army, which controlled Tokyo and surrounding regions, led by General Shizuchi Tanaka. But the plotters faced a dilemma. Neither Mori nor Tanaka had yet committed to the insurrection. And without their support, the coup risked failure. Even so, the conspirators pressed forward, hoping to draw both generals and Anami himself into their scheme. Anami's delicate balance. Loyalty in conflict. On August 12, the plotters approached General Anami directly, presenting their plan and appealing to his deep sense of honor and nationalism. Though Anami opposed surrender and sympathized with their frustration, he stopped short of endorsing treason. Instead, he acted with quiet determination. In a masterful act of stalling, Anami delayed the coup by 24 critical hours, during which he discreetly warned both Mori and Tanaka of the unfolding conspiracy. At the same time, the Suzuki cabinet, now supported unequivocally by the emperor, finalized Japan's decision to surrender without further negotiation. But Anami's ambivalence created dangerous confusion. His evident sympathy for the conspirators led many to believe he might still side with them. Emboldened by this belief, the officers chose to act. The Kyujo Incident, Night of Treachery. In the early hours of August 15, 1945, the coup was set in motion, what would later be called the Kyujo Incident. The conspirators approached General Mori, whose control over the Imperial Guards was vital. But Mori remained loyal to the chain of command and refused to join. His refusal proved fatal. The plotters shot General Mori, then forged orders in his name and sent them across Tokyo. Under these fraudulent directives, units of the Imperial Guards Division mobilized and surrounded the Imperial Palace. Their objective: prevent the broadcast of the emperor's surrender message, which had already been recorded but not yet aired. Soldiers stormed the Imperial Household Agency, ransacking offices in a desperate attempt to locate and destroy the phonograph record of Hirohito's imperial surrender address. For a brief and terrifying moment, the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance. Just one destroyed record could have prolonged the war. Tanaka's intervention, stopping the coup. But the coup would not go unchecked. Upon hearing of the false orders and Mori's death, General Shizuchi Tanaka acted swiftly. Tanaka rushed to the Imperial Palace and confronted the conspirators, exposing the forged commands and the murder of General Mori. Without broader support and now publicly disgraced, the rebels saw no path forward. Their dream of halting the surrender had failed. In a final act of desperation and dishonor, they took their own lives before dawn. The emperor's surrender broadcast was preserved, and on the morning of August 15, 1945, Hirohito's voice reached the Japanese people for the first time in history. His message was calm, somber, and final. A final turning point. What if they had succeeded? The Kyujo incident marks one of the most dramatic what-ifs of World War II. Had the coup succeeded, had the surrender broadcast been destroyed or never recorded, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Fighting could have resumed across the Pacific, with some Japanese units already prepared to engage in guerrilla warfare. The Allied response would have likely included further atomic bombings and a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Operation Downfall plan estimated up to 1 million Japanese casualties and hundreds of thousands of Allied deaths. Japan could have fractured into rival factions, military versus civilian, loyalist versus ultranationalist, plunging the country into civil war even before the foreign occupiers arrived. But thanks to a few key figures, Tanaka, Mori, and even enemies delayed consent, Japan avoided this nightmare scenario. The broadcast aired. The war ended. And the nation was allowed to survive, though irrevocably changed. What if enemy had joined the coup? Of all the pivotal moments in Japan's surrender, none looms larger in the realm of alternate history than this. What if General Korechika enemy had sided with the plotters? The mere thought reshapes the fragile outcome of August 1945. With enemy's influence and authority, the coup might not have failed. It might have succeeded. A turning point, enemy commits. Imagine this alternate timeline. On August 12, rather than merely stalling, General Enemy throws his full support behind the insurrection. He immediately approaches General Yashijiro Yumizu, the army chief of staff. Yumizu, hesitant at first, recognizes the weight enemy carries within the military establishment. Convinced that the coup will succeed with enemy's endorsement, he too agrees to support the uprising. With the top brass united, the coup proceeds as originally planned, set to unfold in the dark hours between August 13th and 14th. A coup in motion, military rule begins. This time, the plotters are not mid-level officers acting alone. They are backed by the highest echelons of the imperial army. Generals Mori and Tanaka, as in the historical timeline, remain loyal to the emperor and reject the plan. But unlike reality, they are assassinated swiftly, removing the last institutional barriers to the military's seizure of power. With enemy and Yumizu publicly endorsing the forged orders, the Imperial Guards Division no longer hesitates. Believing they are executing the will of both the emperor and the army leadership, they move efficiently to isolate the imperial palace, sealing off any communication between Emperor Hirohito and his government. Simultaneously, the Eastern District Army declares martial law, ensuring that Tokyo and its surrounding areas remain firmly under military control. The emperor silenced. In this scenario, Emperor Hirohito is no longer a player. He is a prisoner. While revered as a divine figure, Hirohito's real constitutional power is limited. He cannot independently initiate policy. He can only ratify the decisions of his ministers. With the civilian government dismantled, there is no legal cabinet to advise him, no platform for him to express opposition. Even if he personally opposes the coup, his voice is silenced, both politically and literally. The recorded surrender message is never broadcast. Loyal officials and members of the peace faction are placed under arrest or protective custody. The machinery of the civilian state is effectively dismantled. Cut off and powerless, Hirohito might reluctantly acquiesce to the new military regime, especially if presented with the argument that it protects the Kokutai and preserves the imperial institution. A message to the Allies: the war isn't over. With the new military government solidified under enemy's leadership, a bold message is sent to the Allies: Japan will not surrender. The emperor's voice remains unheard. The message is not ambiguous. The war continues. To the outside world, Japan has just rejected its own offer of surrender. The sudden silence from Tokyo is interpreted as a hostile pivot, not a miscommunication. Allied forces begin immediate preparations to initiate Operation Downfall, the long-dreaded invasion of Japan. In the meantime, Allied bombing campaigns resume with full force, targeting military infrastructure, transport lines, and cities not yet destroyed. With Japan now under overt military rule and diplomatic channels severed, a third atomic bombing, and possibly more, becomes a real possibility. The consequences? A nation destroyed. The human toll in this alternate history is staggering. Millions of Japanese civilians may perish, not just from the fighting, but from famine, disease, and displacement. The military government, propped up by ideology and desperation, continues to resist until the very last resources are depleted. Allied casualties, predicted to be in the hundreds of thousands during a ground invasion, now become a grim reality. Cities like Kyoto, spared in our timeline, may be reduced to rubble. And unlike the historical post-war period, Japan's survival as a unified nation would be in serious doubt. The post-war occupation could involve direct partitioning of Japanese territory, not unlike what occurred in Germany or Korea. The emperor might be dethroned or tried as a war criminal. The Kokutai, the very institution the coup aimed to preserve, would be shattered beyond recognition, making the situation worse. The assumption behind the military coup, that continued resistance would lead to better negotiating terms, was a tragic miscalculation. Anami and his allies believed that by enduring a bit longer, Japan might salvage its sovereignty, or at least secure more favorable post-war conditions. But they gravely misunderstood the reality. The Allies were no longer open to negotiation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just catastrophic bombings, they were warnings. The Soviet entry into the Pacific War had closed the final diplomatic window. From this point forward, the only acceptable outcome for the Allies was unconditional surrender, without proviso or exception. Had the coup succeeded, it's likely that Japan would have crossed a line it could never return from. Once the emperor was sidelined and a military regime installed in his place, any reversal would be seen, internally and externally, as a second betrayal or sign of weakness. The new regime, founded on absolutist ideology and militant loyalty to an abstract kokutai, would be institutionally incapable of ending the war. In fact, the logic of the coup itself would have created a chilling precedent, that anyone advocating for peace, military or civilian, could be accused of disloyalty and executed. It would have become a war without a political off-ramp, fought to the last factory, the last village, the last child. And in such a scenario, millions more would have died, not just Japanese civilians and soldiers, but also Allied forces tasked with invading the home islands. The full weight of Operation Downfall and further atomic bombings would likely have obliterated what remained of Japan's infrastructure and its future. The mystery of Anami's crime. This nightmarish outcome never came to pass, because in the final analysis, General Anami chose loyalty to the emperor over loyalty to ideology. Yet his actions in those final days remain ambiguous. Between August 12th and August 15th, Anami walked a perilous tightrope. He neither fully embraced the coup nor clearly condemned it. He refused to order the arrest of the plotters, failed to denounce their actions publicly, and showed them enough sympathy that they believed he might eventually support them. But perhaps he saw in them the spirit of self-sacrifice he admired. Perhaps he believed they were not traitors, but misguided patriots. Or perhaps he himself was torn between devotion to a crumbling ideal and obedience to a fading emperor. On August 15, 1945, the same day Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast across Japan to announce surrender, Anami rebuffed one final plea, from his own brother-in-law, to join the coup. That night, alone in his quarters, Anami knelt and performed seppuku, the ancient samurai ritual of self-disembowelment. The act was both symbolic and political, an attempt to take personal responsibility, to pay the ultimate price without assigning blame to others. But even in death, Anami left a riddle. His farewell poem read, "Believing firmly that our sacred land shall never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime." What was this great crime? Historians continue to debate its meaning. Was it his own failure to crush the coup? His hesitation to stop the officers he had once trained? Or was it something deeper? His private temptation to side with them, a moment of weakness he could not forgive? We may never know. Final reflection. The events of August 1945 were shaped not just by bombs or battles, but by the decisions of individuals, complex, conflicted, and deeply human. Japan came within hours of sliding into civil war, of dooming its people to annihilation, and of rewriting history's most devastating chapter. General Korechika Anami's restraint, however incomplete, may have spared his nation from that fate. And so we ask again, what if the Japanese had refused to surrender? The answer is clear. The cost would have been unbearable. Like this exploration into alternate history? Subscribe to History Love for more gripping what-if scenarios, deep-dive documentaries, and untold moments that shaped our world. Tell us in the comments, do you think Anami saved Japan by not joining the coup, or was the outcome already inevitable? History isn't just what happened. It's what almost happened, and why it didn't.